what we want to do is give you a chance to share what you have heard, or maybe something that you said that you just, God just really spoke to you, said something significant to you, or you heard somebody else in your group say something. We're going to take time for just 2 or 3 responses from the audience. Who has something to say? Yeah, I heard something, I'm thinking something. You want to share it with the group.
When you were using the pass the torch image, to me it was also you're lifting that torch up and that light is shining. It's the under the bushel syndrome where it's so important for your grandchildren to see Jesus in you. And that was representative to me in holding up that torch.
Great thought. Yes, that's exactly what we're doing, isn't it? Somebody else.
It all sounds great, passing the torch and follow it along. But as I was listening to you, the thing that came into my head was in the area of discipline, when your children perhaps aren't maybe disciplining the way you think they should be at that moment. We were just kind of discussing, where do you step in there? Or is it something you talk about later? And so we had some ideas there. But that was an area that immediately jumped out to me like, whoa, I don't know what to do here.
You and almost everybody else. Yeah. So that is where we're going. That is where we're going to
I know what I want to do. But
yeah. All right. Well, let's continue on with the next part and talk about that then. Thanks so much for your great discussion again. Really glad that you're engaged in that. We want you to continue to do that as we go through it. I imagine that there were a lot of you that were watching this illustration of the passing of the baton or of the torch. And we talk about making a successful baton pass. And you know what happens in a relay race in track and field if they drop the baton? They're disqualified. And some of you in this room have some pain in your hearts because your children aren't carrying the baton. They've dropped the baton. In fact, in the times that I've had to teach this and to learn about it in my own kind of informal surveys, what I found out that there's probably 2/3 of us in this room, 2/3 of you that are watching by video, that have some pain and heartache because you have an adult child that's walked away. That's what the numbers are normally. Should we do a show of hands? I'm not going to ask you to do anything other, but if you have an adult child that's not walking with God like you'd like to see them, raise your hand. Yeah, a lot of hands. That's what I see everywhere. You know what I find out? This is not something we talk about very much. We might share it with 1 or 2 people, maybe our close friends. But you also know that when your adult children aren't walking with God, it leads to lots of difficult, unwise decisions many times. And it ends up being the greatest pain of grandparenting. If there's anything, the hidden pain, the private pains, that's what I'm calling this section is the private pains of grandparenting. It's the pain of our adult children walking away from God, and we're hurt and frustrated because we don't know what to do. We don't know how to respond. But what we also don't realize is that we're almost all in the boat together. Many of us are struggling with an adult child that's not walking with God. And how do we carry out this vision if our adult children don't have spiritual training as their priority? What do we do? So part of the picture that is really quite bleak for us is that so many of us are sharing a pain that we don't talk about, but we share it. The pain of our adult kids walking away. And then there's another part of the pain too, and that's revealed by a lot more studies. About 10 years ago in children's ministry, the Christian researcher George Barna revealed a study that he had done about what's happening with the children of the Christian families in America. And his numbers weren't very good. It was like 60% of the children in the Christian families of America are walking away from their faith upon leaving home, whether it's to go to college or move out on their own or whatever, about 60% are. And then others began to do the same research. And over the past 10 years, there's been a whole lot of organizations that have done it. Gallup has done polls on it. The National Pew Research Institute has done it. Lifeway has done some research. Josh McDowell Ministries has done it. Many. There are probably a dozen, maybe 20, 30 that have done studies on, so what happens to our Christian young people when they leave home? Let me kind of give you the middle of the road response, because they're almost all the same. Here's the middle of the road response. When our Christian young people, so let's translate this, our grandchildren, when our grandchildren turn like 19 or 20 and they begin to go on to their own, whether that's off to college or leaving the home and living on their own, when our grandchildren get to that age, 70% of them are walking away from their faith practice, if not from their faith. 70% of our grandchildren. And then we find out that some of them come back. And they come back, of course, when they have kids. They come back when they come to their senses, amen? but they come back. However, only about 2 to 3 of 10 come back. So if we have 70%, 7 of 10 walk away, 2 to 3 come back. What it means is that by the ages of 30 to 35, we still have about half of our children that are not living their faith, not following the faith that we would like to see them follow. And the hands that you raised in the air says, yeah, it's true of us. And you know what I find out? Churches don't talk about this very much. I don't know because it's painful or what, but we don't talk about it a whole lot. I want to give you 3 reasons why I think that we don't talk about it so much. The first reason is this. I think the problem is unintended. You know, if I were to ask, so how many of you intended that those adult kids that aren't following God, how many of you intended that they would walk away? I mean, you said, you know what, from the very beginning, I planned on raising a prodigal, just like that. That was my plan from the start to do that. Anybody say that? No, of course not. We have the best of intentions. And because we know that people around us have the best of intentions, a lot of times we just don't talk about it. I think that's one reason why we're quiet. Second reason is this, is because it's not measured. We don't measure it for us. I learned this lesson when I was teaching an adult class at my church in the Chicago area. My class was 40-somethings and 50-somethings. They weren't all grandparents, but they were all empty nesters. Our kids had all grown up, and we were talking about these numbers for, I think, in a class at some point. We were talking about the results. And one of my friends, a man named Mark, raised his hand, and he said, Larry, can I interrupt you for a second? I said, sure. And his voice began to crack and waver, and he said, Larry, I'm 1 for 3. And you know what he was telling me? Of his adult kids, only 1 of his 3 was walking with God. And one of his friends reached over and put his hand on his shoulder, and he said, Mark, don't you feel bad? He said, I'm 0 for 2. And another dad said, well, I'm 2 for 4. And it became one of those God moments where suddenly our whole class was just transparent. And all of a sudden I realized this wasn't about national numbers. This was about my class and my friends. It was their kids that was walking away, and we had never talked about it before. You see, we don't measure it in our churches. We look at the national numbers and we click our tongues at the numbers. But when it comes to our church and our situation, we don't measure it. Let me tell you something. I believe this is the greatest crisis facing America. The churches of America. Greatest crisis is not in our politics. The greatest crisis is if the main product of our churches is turning out to not be what it wanted to be. So many of you are businesses. What if you had a business and 50% of the time the product that you were producing failed? How long would you be in business? If there's any product of our churches, it ought to be that children that grow up in our churches follow God and continue to be involved in their faith. Does that make sense to you? And if we're losing 50% of them after 30 years, then that to me is nothing short of a crisis. And I believe it's the greatest crisis facing our church. You see, those of us in this room, we have the chance of losing many of our grandchildren to the world. Because that's what's happening in the Christian families of America. You know, there's a great lesson to be learned from 9/11. Anybody remember what happened on 9/11? Oh, of course you do. Do you remember a miracle that happened on 9/11? Not in the morning. I'm saying this kind of tongue-in-cheek. There was a miracle that happened in the evening. Anybody remember what it was? It was in Washington, D.C. On the Capitol building. Yes. The Democrats and Republicans prayed together. Our government officials prayed. That by itself is a miracle, isn't it? And then they not only prayed, they prayed together. Republicans and Democrats. Remember them all gathering there on the Capitol building steps and they prayed. Now what made the difference? How did they go from being bickering, fighting, polarized parties to praying together in 24 hours? Because the night before, that's what they were. You know what made the difference? Two things. The enemy became close, and the enemy became real. We thought Al-Qaeda, we had heard of it, but we didn't think they were anywhere close. We thought they were on the other side of the world. So all of a sudden they went from being far away to being close. And we weren't really sure what they were, and all of a sudden they became incredibly real. Do you understand? And we will not make any changes in how we grandparent or how we parent until the enemy, the world taking our grandchildren, becomes close and real. So I have an exercise for you. On your pages, on your notes, you have an opportunity. There are 10 boxes there, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to write the names of your grandchildren, your grandparents. If you have one, obviously you're going to write one name down. If you have more than 10, just write 10, okay? But write the names of your grandkids. I'm going to give you just a second or two to do this. You can begin to do it while I'm talking, but write the names of your grandchildren down on the list there as far as they have. Somebody had asked, so how many do I have? I have 6 grandkids and the 7th on the way. They range from 19 down to the one that's to pop out in a few months. And so I would write down 6 and then I'd put a question mark there. So you can put the question mark there too if you want. But this should have, now I've talked probably long enough that you've had the time to write the names. Now here's what I want you to understand. Here's what I want you to do. If your family is a typical Christian family in America, not a bad one, typical. If you're average, not below average, you all got it? I'm talking if you're average, 70% of your grandkids will walk away. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to take that pen. I want you to scratch out the names of 70% of your grandkids. Which ones are they going to be? No, not really. I'm not really going to ask you to do that. The first time I did this, a lady says, no, I'm not doing that. But I wanted just for a second, I wanted for you to feel the pain and heartache of what it might be if it was your grandkids. You know what? If it was me sitting there and you were given the instruction to me, I couldn't do it either. How could I do that? How could I scratch out a name? But if we are to look ahead, past to the time that our grandchildren get to be adults, that's what's going to happen. This is the greatest crisis facing us, and it's one that we really have to address and have to understand. But can I come back from that for a second and just give you some hope? Please. Okay, please. Yeah. Think about the person in the New Testament that is probably the greatest example of a disciple. The greatest example of disciple, not of the 12 apostles, a disciple. If I were to think of somebody, I would think of Timothy. Timothy's just a great example of a disciple. Do you know that Timothy had 3 spiritual influences in his life that were powerful? The Apostle Paul says it was his grandmother Lois, his mother Eunice, and then, of course, the Apostle Paul. Let me just remind you of a spiritual triangle and say, the parents are primary. They're the ones on the bottom. They're the foundation for that. But think about what can happen if children have a spiritual grandfather, a spiritual grandmother, a spiritually minded one, a spiritual mentor from the church. If that surrounds them, it's a powerful thing to have an influence on them. So when we see these numbers, one of the things we want to say is, let's get that spiritual power triangle surrounding them. And if one side isn't there, if the parents aren't there, but you have a chance to influence them, and if there's a way that you can get them in a situation where the church has a chance to influence them, it's still a huge, huge, powerful impact in the lives of children. 2 out of the 3 is awesome. All 3 is just wonderful. Grandparent, parent, spiritual mentor. Wonderful, wonderful influence in the lives of kids. So now let's have another discussion. And this time it's going to be a little tougher. So how are your kids doing? How are your kids doing? What's our question? Our question is this one. Share with your group where your children are spiritually. Go.